Okay. Oh, whatever. Good evening. I'm Father James Blomley, and this evening we're continuing with our study of St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And we're in chapter 5 of that. And it really has been a very excellent book to look at. And hopefully everybody here has already, or everybody listening, has already read it at one time or another. But even if you have, it's profitable to go back and to look at it and to read it again, because it really has enormous depth, much more, oftentimes we read an epistle and we read it and, it's interesting and we learn a few things and we learn some stuff about Paul and about the people that he's writing to, but there's usually a much greater depth to it. And so I would really highly recommend that everybody think about going back and reading the book of Ephesians in a very deep kind of way, because it's a very, very multifaceted, multi-level kind of book. So, but tonight we're on chapter 5, and if you remember, the first 3 chapters of Ephesians really dealt with primarily really some ringing and soaring and exalted theology, which in fact was where Paul talks about the meaning of what has happened as far as the incarnation and the coming of Jesus, and what happened on the cross, and why that's so important to everybody. And so it's because of that he goes on, and it really, there's enormously deep throughout those 3 chapters, this idea of how wonderful and what God's intentions are and were and will be. And then he starts in chapter 4 to start fitting that to individuals and to people. And primarily in chapter 4, he did so as far as the church was concerned. Now with the church, when he wrote chapter 4 and he's talking about the church, he intimately connects that with the work of Jesus, with what has happened, and then links everything with what he talks about in the first 3 chapters of Ephesians. So we have 4, but now tonight in chapter 5, it becomes a much more personal kind of thing. It becomes a treatise, if you will, an instruction book for everyday Christians, for all of us that are in the church, for all of us that are believers in Christ, and how we are supposed to fulfill the commandments of Christ. And one thing that struck me as I read it in preparation for this is that there are really strong echoes, if you will, of the teaching surrounding the Sermon on the Mount, and in particular the Beatitudes. When we read, even though he does not specifically make reference to those things in chapter 5, when you read this chapter, you can't help but think about those instructions, that teaching of Christ himself. So we start with chapter 5, and I'll read verses 1 and 2 initially, and then we'll move on from there. These are the beginning verses. And this is where Paul really begins to speak to individuals, as individuals, about how they are supposed to conduct their lives and themselves and their dealings with other people. So beginning with verse 1, it says, "Therefore, be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma." The interesting thing about that reading is that he begins by calling the Ephesians to a life which imitates Christ, which is, in fact, it's kind of a tall order. Christ had quite a life, but the characteristics that he's speaking of do in fact apply to all of us. So that if you have this sense of what Paul talks about in these verses in mind, you understand that life is sacrificial, that it is lived not for ourselves alone, but we were also living our life for the benefit of others. And in fact, later on in the chapter, I'll specifically talk about who some of those others are. But it's founded on a spirit of sacrifice. It is founded on the love for others. All of these things are characteristics of Christ himself. And then he says to walk worthy in the calling. This is really a very strong kind of command, if you will, for people. Because we often talk about living this way. We often talk, and I think on some level, we all know that this, in fact, is the Christian life. But the Christian life can so often get kind of lose sight of it in light of everything else that's going on around you. We could lose our focus. We can lose the faith that we have. We can lose our courage. And so it's important as we go through this to apply this to your own life, to apply this to how you're living. Think about within the last week or so, how have your contacts with other people been? What kind of connection have you had? What kind of, what are they seeing when they see you? What do they think when they hear you? And so we have to really look at this very carefully. This is very, very serious stuff. So all of those things, that's just a few of the aspects of what a Christian life looks like. So we have to ask ourselves how that's going to play out. How does that play out in the life that we are called to live? Well, as he says, we are called to walk in love. We are called to walk in the light. We are called to walk in wisdom. And now remember, if you will, he uses the word walk. And this is important. He doesn't say sprint. He doesn't say, he just says walk. And walk is a deliberate, sometimes slow kind of thing, depending on your age, I guess. And so to walk is simply to put one foot out before the other and to go from one place to another. It's not, they're power walkers, but by and large, walking is not a rushed activity. Walking is something where if you walk with somebody else, it's a time when you can have conversation with that person. If you are out and about, it's a time when you have an opportunity to observe what's going on around you and where you are. So to walk means a very deliberate act. It's not accidental. You're going from one place to another, and you're aware that you're going from one place to another. And so these are the things then that characterize the walk that we are called to do. The love, the light, the wisdom, the other things that we're going to talk about in a little bit, all of these things become important. And all of these things, what's implied is a steady pace, a determination to get to the other level, whatever your end point is, and perseverance. If you get tired, you're going to keep on walking. And I think that's generally the way that it is. So we're now going to look at verses 3 through 7 and look at the next parts that are there. So in 3 through 7, this is kind of the rules for taking a walk, if you will. All right, verse 3, but fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you as is fitting for saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this you know, that no fornicator, unclean person, or covetous man who is an idolater has any inheritance of the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words. For because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not be partakers with them. So to separate yourself from people that behave in certain ways, that doesn't mean you hate those people or have to hate those people. What it means is that you understand that for you as a Christian to be around those people is not at all profitable and can, in fact, be actually pretty harmful to what's going on. So, if you talk about this idea of filthy or foolish talking, if you talk about coarse jokes of one kind or another, dirty jokes, if you will, if you talk about fornicators or covetous people, these are all people that are concerned with activities outside of themselves, right? If people are engaged or want to be engaged in fornication, they're talking about getting some other person involved in it. If they covet something that belongs to some other person. If they talk in a foolish or filthy way, they're trying to entertain, if you will, the people that are listening to them. And for these things to be talked about in that way. There is a lot, the fathers talk a lot about this idea about the kind of talk that we have, right? And the effect that talk has. St. John Chrysostom called this clamor. Clamor is when you're expressing anger at somebody And most especially, it's when the whole herd of people are expressing anger at somebody at the same time. St. John Chrysostom said, if you cut off clamor, and you will clip the wings of anger, which is a pretty apt kind of observation. In other words, if you just don't engage in it, if you just don't get into that crowd, if you don't take part in whatever anger they're exhibiting, then you will be all for the best. You are outside of that. You are different from that. That's not to say that maybe those people don't have a point. Maybe they do. But whatever that point is, the most important thing that can happen for us is that we maintain our focus on Christ in every circumstance, at all times. It's a very important kind of thing. You know, it's interesting. You think about that, like what St. John Chrysostom said, and then you think about the state of the church during the Arian controversy. You remember Arius and, the trouble that he brought. And this is why Constantine, who was emperor at the time, he just became emperor, just had his vision. And he told the bishops, we got to fix this because people are in the marketplaces, they're rioting over this. If you're in favor of Arius, you're singing songs in favor of him. If you were against Arius, you sang songs against him, and then riots were breaking out. And it just not only upset the church, it upset the entire nation, the entire empire, if you will, leading to that. But that can be the outcome of clamor and that kind of thing. Well, then we also say, John Chrysostom goes on to say this, he says, this just as clamor was the fuel of wrath, so foul talk is the fuel of lust. See, in essence, what St. John is saying is that this is what happens if you listen to even, not much less engage in, these kinds of conversations, this kind of talk, because it has an effect on our soul, and it can lead us to do things that are sinful, in which we have no reason, no way that we should be doing any of these things. And so he talks about that pretty extensively. So this is the beginning, right? We know that we do not associate and we do not cooperate, we don't participate with people that are acting and living in this particular way. We hold ourselves separate from them. Doesn't mean we hate anybody, doesn't mean that if they came to church, we wouldn't welcome them, but it does mean that that is not us, and it simply shouldn't be us. Now, next in verses 8 through 10, he develops this a little bit, and he says this, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. So in that he kind of sums up what he'd been saying before. We are different. We are held out. We are separate in a lot of ways. Now we're in the midst of everybody else. I mean, it's not like we're living on an island all by ourselves. But we must take care of our own souls. That's the beginning. If we take care of our own souls, many other virtues will come off of that. It's not, and again, like I said a minute ago, it is not that we hate people, it's not that we disparage people, it's not that we call them names, we don't do any of those things. We live the way in which we are supposed to live. So, if walking in Christ is light, which is what Paul says, and if you look at this and you think about what I just said, which is not as good as what Paul said, but kind of along those lines, you can see that this is one thing that the Christian needs, is an enormous discernment. Needs a really finely honed kind of discernment. And that discernment is not necessarily based on judging other people, right? Discernment is not saying this person is evil, and if he came in and, if I ever had the chance to help him, I'd just spit in his face. That's not discernment, that's judgment. But instead, discernment is being able to say, this is not anything I need to be a part of. This isn't anything that I need to cooperate in or take a part in. And when we do that, if we do that with the yardstick, so to speak, with the filter of Christ upon us, then we will understand what we can and should not do, what we can do, what's okay, and what really we just don't have any business at all getting into. And it's probably true in some sense that may be different for different people. Different people may be more badly affected by one thing than another person is, and you have to think about your own problems there, your own weaknesses. But by whatever means, the same thing applies to all of us. There are certain things, certainly, that we should not do. So discernment is not the same as judgment. Discernment is simply wisdom. And we exercise that wisdom based on what we are taught in church, what we are taught in prayer, what we are taught in our dealings with other Christians. And that helps to define for us what our world is, the world where we can actually operate in a Christian kind of manner. All right, so the next reading is verses 11 through 16. Now, 11 through 16 is something that has been, I think, probably misinterpreted a number of times. And it's important that we listen to this and read this and apply it in the proper way, the sense that the fathers did. So here's what St. Paul writes, starting with verse 11. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light. For whatever makes manifest is light. Therefore, he says, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. You know, what's interesting about this is that the fathers see this not, if you read that in a certain way, it makes it sound like you are going to go expose people for their sins, right? You're going to go up to somebody and say, hey, I know that you did whatever it is, right? And in one sense, that's a sense of exposure that some people have actually adopted over time in different places and in different ways, but that's not what they mean. St. John Chrysostom talks about this when he talks about, if I can find it, and here's what he says, St. John. He says, now the light reproves by making to appear the things which take place in darkness, so that if we are virtuous and are to be admired, the evil will be unable to remain imperceptible. For just as when a candle is set, all are brought to light, and the robber cannot enter, so if your light shine, the evil being scrutinized shall be easy to capture. So then it is needful to expose them. Paul did not say judge. He said reprove. What Paul is saying is of this sort. As a wound, so long as it is embedded and concealed, running beneath the surface, it enjoys not a bit of attention, but also sin, as long as it is hidden, being as it were in darkness, is daringly committed with full license. You know, in a sense, if you think about it, what Paul is saying here is reminiscent of, a city cannot be hidden upon a hill, the light cannot be hidden, the lamp cannot be covered. You remember all of those things that Jesus talked about. And that, I think, has the same meaning as what Paul is trying to say here. Because what Paul is saying is that if you are living a Christian life, that witness, that testimony alone, will oftentimes make people aware of sin that perhaps they had not really thought about. They're probably aware of it, but didn't think there was anything wrong, or they were so used to it that they just thought that's just the way that they were. But if they can be exposed to a person who lives in that different way, to that person, their sin is exposed, their own sin is exposed. And so they are reproved, and not in the sense that anybody's going to go and point a finger at them, and point it and shake it in their face, but simply by being found out, if you will, by seeing somebody who does not have that fault. And so we have this notion about exposing the darkness, and that simply means, at the end of the day, we expose darkness not by, going on vendettas or picking out somebody and giving them a hard time. We expose and we reprove simply by living the way we are supposed to live. Now, if we are failing or have failed at that, and we are not living in the way or walking in the way in which Christ told us to, then we won't have that effect at all. In fact, it could be the other way around. But this is one reason. This is the beginning reason that Paul says this is why we have to behave in this way, so that people will be able to see their own problems, not because they have been attacked, but because they can look at themselves and then look at this other person, this Christian person who lives in the way that they're supposed to be living. So he goes on then, and he talks about what this means, and he talks about being filled with the Spirit in verses 17 through 21. In those verses, here's what St. Paul says. He says, "Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another in the fear of God." In a way, the most important part of that section that I just read is really that very first part, the first sentence. "Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is." And that's why it's important to really understand what Paul has said in everything up until now, because that's the will of the Lord for all of us. The walking circumspectly, the way in which we should behold ourselves, the way in which we should behave, the way in which we are with others, the way in which we are in the world. All of those things are it's really important. So to be filled with the Spirit is simply to be filled with the Spirit of Christ. It's not, as in some modern places, it doesn't mean that, that we're charismatic or whatever. We are filled with the Spirit because we are filled with the love of Christ, and our life reflects that. And all of our lives should, in fact, reflect that. So, at first blush, so you look at it and you say, well, is he just saying that when we're with each other, that all we can do is, sing hymns and psalms and that kind of thing? And that is not really it at all. And St. John Chrysostom talked about this at all. He said, this is not merely singing the words, and in a sense, what he's saying here applies to every thought that we have. But he says that he's talking about the singing, right? He says, this is not merely singing the words, but doing so with understanding and attention. If not, then the mind wanders while the tongue sings. So what St. John is saying here is that it's not that that's all that you did, but that you have entered into a life, into a style of life, into a church, which in fact commands all of your being. I mean, it demands all of your attention. It demands all of your efforts. Obviously, we all have jobs elsewhere. We work outside of home, or we're involved in activities with other people that don't necessarily fit that. And we know how we're supposed to act when we do that. But then what also he's saying is this. He's saying that when we are together, when we are in a group, when we are in church, that we submit to one another. That humility becomes something that is really, really important. And in fact, it's a ton of stuff has been written about that by different fathers of the church. Some of them, and all of them essentially say that among Christians in a church or together in some fashion, that there's this duty, if you will, of humility. There's this sense that nobody rules over anybody else. And it's interesting, but Jerome, who is not an Orthodox saint necessarily, but is still, considered well, and he's what they call a doctor in the West, I guess. He wrote this, which I thought was pretty good. Here's what Jerome said, speaking about this epistle, about this verse. He said, "Let bishops hear this, let priests hear it, let every rank of learning get this clear. In the church, leaders are servants. Let them imitate the apostle. The difference between secular rulers and Christian leaders is that the former love to be lord over their subordinates, whereas the latter serve them." Which is a good, strong statement, but it also tells the rest of us, tells everybody else, everybody that's just in the church, that sense of humility, that spirit of being open and asking forgiveness and giving forgiveness and doing all of these things becomes very, very important for all of us. This is how we differentiate ourselves, not only by the way in which we live our life when we are just working or out of the church or doing whatever we do on an everyday basis. We must have the same attitude and the same way of living and relating with other people when we're in the church itself. So what this means when you get down to it then is that at the end of the day, what it boils down to is this, that we are being together with brethren. When we are with brethren, this rule is still in place. That being in the church, the rule is in place. Giving thanks in good times and in bad times, which is another distinction also drawn by the fathers. In fact, Jerome in another place said, one characteristic of the Christian faith that no one else has is that we can give thanks for bad things that are bad as well as things that are good. And the church itself and all the people in it need to be able to do the same thing. That's not a nice thing to think, and that's not a comforting thing to think about. But think about, if you will, during the periods of persecution, how many churches, all the people stayed in the church knowing that something terrible was going to happen, but they did that because they had faith in Christ, and they could accept that bad things would happen, but it would be for their good. And so we are called to subordinate ourselves one to another, to be with our brethren, and to be willing to give of ourselves and to sacrifice for them just as they are going to be willing to sacrifice for us. And so that's a really important thing when we talk about dealing within the church and being with other people. Well, then that brings us to what is probably the most famous part of chapter 5 of Ephesians, having to do with marriage. Everybody hears it multiple times, depending on how many marriages you go to or conduct, or how many weddings or marriages are blessed, and you always hear this. It's a very familiar piece of scripture. But before I read it, I want you to think about this. As you listen to what Paul says, this is entirely consistent with what we have heard earlier this evening. It's entirely consistent with everything else in chapter 5. But in a lot of ways, he uses marriage, and he saves marriage for the last, because marriage becomes this foundation. And because it is also illustrates a mystery of Christ in the church, to understand marriage is to understand the church and Christ, that entire relationship, which is fundamental to us being able to live as Christians and to understand what's happening to us. So let me read those verses to you. It's even though you've heard them a million times, I know that's true. All right, here's what he says. And this outrages some people. Don't get outraged right now. We'll talk about it in a minute. Here's what Paul says. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason a man shall leave his wife, father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. To try to unpack this is a little bit daunting. Let's start with Christ and the church, and then look at marriage within that light. If we think about Christ, and in this first paragraph, the first few verses, he talks about this, that Christ is the head of the church, that he very much sacrificed of himself. He gave up his own life. He underwent crucifixion and burial, and then, of course, resurrection for the church. He suffered for the church, and the church is the composite of all of us, all the people around the world, all over the place, the Orthodox Christians in the church. This is what Christ died for. This is what he created. This is what was intended by God. You remember, that stuff is in the first 3 chapters of Ephesians. So if this was the intention of God, and this is what Christ had to do this, and if this is the way in which this is done, then we can talk about, at that point, when Paul says that marriage is kind of like that, it's not because Jesus is like the rule, being weird to people, and hitting them over the head or anything like that. Jesus, in the church and in the context of Christians, is there for our best interest. It's there so that we ourselves may come to know him, and we ourselves may, in fact, know the joys of paradise upon the end of our life. That's what Jesus does. Now, we can, make our own life unpleasant and miserable by doing things that Paul's already mentioned, or we can do what Jesus says. So for Paul, this becomes, if you will, a kind of a model for marriage. It becomes this way of understanding the way in which a husband and wife are going to communicate, the way in which they're going to do things, the way in which the family is composed, the way in which a household is made. In the Orthodox Church, we call every household with a husband and a wife a little church. And when we marry people, we put crowns on them, and we do that because in a symbolism of they're becoming this little church is being formed. And then those two people will oftentimes have children, and then those children are raised within the little church and then within the greater church as well. And if you give it some time to think about it, this is an enormously it's something that you could kind of lose yourself in if you think about this. And there are a couple of readings about this that I wanted to mention to you. And here's this one. This is from St. Simeon, the new theologian. He was the last person ever given the title of theologian. He only lived over 1,000 years ago, so someday we'll find another one, but he's the last one that the church has ever named. And so he had this thought. He wrote this about looking at this passage here, and thinking about what that means for us. And you remember that in this passage, there was a part of it that said that for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as the Lord does the church. Here's what St. Simeon said. He said, see how he shows us that just as Eve was taken from the flesh and bones of Adam, and the two were one flesh, so also Christ gives himself to us to the extent of communion of his flesh and bones. From the same flesh and bones he gives us to eat, and through this communion makes us too one with him. Again, the apostle wanting to make God's contact with us absolutely clear as, for this reason, shall a man leave his father and mother, meaning that he leaves them for the sake of Christ, and shall cleave to his wife, that is, the church, and the two shall be into one flesh. Clearly he means the flesh of Christ God. And to show that the text is to be interpreted in this sense, and that we do not arrive at this meaning through forced reasoning, the apostles added, this mystery is great, but I speak in regard to Christ, and in regard to the church. Truly, therefore, this mystery is great, and beyond great. And so it will always be, because the same sort of communion and union and intimacy and kinship which the woman has with the man and the man with the woman, such understood in a manner adequate to God and as transcending our reason, is the relation which the master and maker of all has with all the church, as with a single woman, blamelessly, ineffably, inseparably, and indivisibly united to her, being and living with her, as with the one whom he loves and holds dear. Thus, in turn, the church, united to her, most dear God, joins herself to him as the whole body to its own head. As the body cannot live at all without being attached to its head, then neither can the church of the faithful, and I say rather of the sons of God, whose names are inscribed in the heavens, in any way be a proper and whole body for God without her head, Christ God himself. Nor can she live the true and imperishable life without being fed by him with her daily and substantial bread. From the latter comes life and growth into the perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, and for all of those who love him. So you can see that what Paul is getting at here is not just a rule like, okay, guys get to do all the stuff, you know, and if you disagree, guys get to say what's going to happen. I mean, superficially, that's it. But he also has set this up as a much, much more mystical kind of union. One that is down to earth every day, but one that also reflects the love that Christ has for the church and for everybody in the church. And so this is a really astonishing chapter of the letter. There's more packed into this thing than you could possibly unpack in an hour, however long. And everybody should really think very hard about going back and reading it carefully and looking at the notes and thinking about what this means and how it applies to you. Are you walking circumspectly? Are you walking in the right way? Are you putting one foot in front of the other and living the Christian life? Are you not associating with things we ought not associate with? Are we serious enough and committed enough that when people look at us, they can say, that person's a little different somehow or another, and might start thinking, I just feel kind of weird about me doing this or that or something. It's just knowing that person, it just kind of changes me some. This is what we're called to, and this is what Paul clearly describes in this chapter. So I do urge you to go back and read it and think about it. It is very much a very wonderful chapter. Next week we'll finish it. We'll do chapter 6 of the book of Ephesians next week. And so thank you very much. And hopefully I will be talking at you, I guess, next week. Thank you. I think Rob is doing that, I think. Yeah, I think he did. Okay, good.
George is on the other end.
No, Rob is.
Rob is. Okay.
Yeah. George said he's out of town, so he's I guess trained Rob to be the backup.